This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to the podcast of Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. In today's talk, originally presented on June 5, 2009, Dr. Warren Allmon, Director of the Paleontological Research Institution and Cornell Professor of Earth Sciences, discusses the emergence of the intelligent design concept in current debates about evolution. As Dr. Allmon observes, intelligent design theory has gained some surprising traction as a political agenda in the United States. But as a robust explanation for life's evolving complexity on Earth, it fails the test of good science.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being here. I know the alumni, anyway, have a lot of other choices this morning, so thank you. This is, I forget which publicity item said Warren Allmon will be reading from his book. And this is, of course, not the kind of book you read from. So what I thought I would do is turn the microphone on. Let's look at that. What I thought I would do is give you some brief remarks, and hopefully brief remarks, and then about the context of the book, and then hopefully that will generate some questions. And of course, if you want more information, there's a book. So let me tell you a little bit more about where this book came from first, because that's an important part of the story. You may remember in 2005, there was a very well-covered trial not too far from here in Dover, Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania. And the trial was, in a nutshell, a lawsuit brought by a group of parents against the school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, saying that a policy that the school board had passed was unconstitutional. That policy said, it was a very simple policy, it said that in every high school biology class in the district, and there weren't that many, the teacher must read a statement, a very short statement, and the statement, paraphrasing, said that the theory of evolution has problems, and you should think about those problems, and if you want to know more about alternatives to Darwinian evolution, you can read this book called Pandas and People. And it specifically named that book. So that all happened in 2004. A lawsuit was brought. It came to federal court in the late summer and fall of 2005. And that became the latest in a long stream of American so-called monkey trials. And so that fall, because of what PRI does, we were we were one of many institutions that was being called by the media, and the general public was asking lots of questions. We actually started a number of new programs to respond to that, and we also got in the New York Times a couple of times because this topic was so hot during that time. And to make things even more interesting, you may remember that Hunter Rawlings, who was then interim president, with, as he put it, nothing to lose, in his annual State of University speech in October of 2005, instead of saying, all is well at Cornell, everything's going great, here's what we did over the past year, he said, intelligent design is a threat to science education in America. And this made front page news all over the country and all over the world. Here's an Ivy League president taking the opportunity to speak to the university on this topic. And I asked Hunter, actually, at Christmas time, I was at his house, and I said, so I have to ask you, what got into you? And he said, well, I had nothing to lose. But then he said, I was just mad. So there was a lot of discussion about that. It was a really hot topic in the media. So in the middle of all that, Jill Schneiderman, my co-editor, Jill and I went to graduate school together. She is a professor at Vassar College, a professor of geology, and she called me sometime in the fall of 2005, and she said, we have to do something about this. This is just nuts. We have to do something. And I said, Jill, I'm up to here with it. This is nothing I can do. I'm doing all this other stuff. She said, okay, but I just got to use your name. I'll do all the work. And when somebody says that, First of all, don't believe them, but so she went out and found a publisher. She solicited the manuscripts. She did all the editing, etc., etc. But these things take time. So the book actually did not appear until 2008. And so that's the first thing. That by the time this book actually appeared, intelligent design was way off the front page. And in fact, if you Google intelligent design today, you will not find a lot that is very current about it. And I'll say more about that in a second. The other thing to understand about this is Jill is not a paleontologist. Jill is a real geologist. She studies volcanoes and metamorphic rocks and sediments, and so she has a sympathy for paleontologists, but she's not a paleontologist. So why was she interested in intelligent design? And therein lies the story, and that's one of the things I want to leave you with today. Intelligent design and creationism in general often are, people will point out at people like me and say, what are you so worked up about? I mean, so who cares if everybody doesn't understand Charles Darwin, and who cares if a few biology professors are upset about this? You know, no big deal. And the general response, and this is what I consider to be the thing that every American, every person should know about this topic, is that if creationism is correct, and as I'll say, intelligent design is just a version of creationism. If creationism is correct, then it isn't just evolutionary biology that is incorrect. It is most of modern science, if not all of modern science. Now, in the particular case of intelligent design, the promulgation of it and the popular discussion of it in the media did not talk about anything except biology. And the intricacy of design of organisms. So what's geology doing here? And in fact, we had trouble finding a publisher for exactly that purpose. They said, geology, what's geology have to do with intelligent design? And and people who should have known better said that. And I find that completely fascinating. That means that people who should know better don't really get what's most important about creationism, which is that it is a threat to all of modern science. And that's really what we tried to do in this book. Now, the book itself, because of the way these things work, is it has some marvelous chapters in it by a whole bunch of really smart people, but it doesn't break huge new ground in all of those chapters. Many of the chapters are very conventional. They're very interesting, but they don't break a lot of new ground. But there are a couple of chapters in this book that we think do kind of broach the issue of so what? And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. I recommend all of the chapters to you, but there are just a few in there that are perhaps a little novel. So what I want to do is just give you a really, really quick Evolution 101 here for just 5 minutes, and so that everybody can start on the same page. Okay, what is evolution? Evolution, we're not talking about evolution of the English language or evolution of Volkswagens or anything. We're talking about the evolution of living things. And so far, for now, anyway, we're talking about living things on this planet. That will change almost certainly in the next few decades. But for the moment, evolution of life on Earth. The hypothesis that all organisms are connected by genealogy and have changed through time. That's all it is. Now, why that particular, and you can wordsmith this if you want to. This is my articulation of it. But there are two important elements here. Change through time and genealogical connection. You've got to have both. Why? Because really smart people, including the founder of zoology at this university, Louis Agassiz, who was a professor at Harvard and was hired by Ezra and A.B. White to come and found zoology here and geology. Louis Agassiz was a very smart guy. Louis Agassiz believed in change through time, but he didn't believe in genealogical connection. So he thought everything that changed was created and then killed off, and created and killed off, and created and killed off. So you got to have both. You got to have genealogical connection and change through time. That's what evolution is. Evolution, fun factoid for this Darwin bicentennial year, the word evolution does not appear in the first edition of The Origin of Species. In fact, it appears for the very first time in the 6th edition, which is the edition that most people read, and therefore everybody thinks Darwin invented the word. He didn't. The word was invented by other authors after The Origin was published, and Darwin adopted it later. And we now use that word all the time. Darwin didn't use that word in The Origin in the first edition. The last word of the first edition is evolved, but the word evolution does not appear. Darwin used a much better term. Sometimes he said transmutation, but he used a much better term more often. He called it descent with modification. And it's still the best term invented for what this is, because it includes those two essential concepts, genealogical connection and change through time. So what I mean when I say evolution is descent with modification. The book tries to do two things, and as Mary said, there's an exhibit down at Kroc Library, and let me put in a plug also for the other half of that exhibit, which is out at the Museum of the Earth for 45 more hours. It's a two-part exhibit. It's called Darwin After the Origin, because this year is not only the bicentennial of Darwin's birth, but it's the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. Darwin was born in February. He was smart enough to publish his greatest book when he was 50, so we have these nicely spaced anniversaries. And he also published it in November, and so we can celebrate for the whole year. So November 24th, circle it on your calendars, is when The Origin was published. The Origin is now selling extremely well, it being this famous year. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'll just say that if you haven't read it, you're not an educated person. And it's a really good book. It's a really good book. Don't believe what you hear. It is very accessible. It's fun to read. He really knows how to turn a phrase. Okay. If you read that book, you will discover that Darwin tries to do two things. Two different things. Related, but different. The first thing he tries to do is he tries to convince his reader that descent with modification is true. That descent with modification, which is a hypothesis, explains a huge array of observations. And one reason that modern readers don't like to read The Origin is because it is a catalog of examples. And another one, and another one, and another one. And you want to say, all right, all right. But he's trying to convince his reader that this is the case. And he marshals so much evidence, and historically we know this is true, that people said, well, I didn't know there was that much evidence for it. And they still don't today. That's why it's a good book. So that's the first thing he tries to do. And in this first task, Darwin is completely successful. By that I mean, Darwin convinces, and pardon the phrase, I haven't come up with a better one, anybody who knows anything, meaning anybody who has actually looked at any of this information, any of the observations, and judged them critically and scientifically. That's what I mean by anybody who knows anything. Darwin convinced anybody who knows anything by the time he died. He died in 1882. Within 20 years, it's all over. When Darwin died, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, by the way, when Darwin died, he's buried in Westminster Abbey because he convinced the thinking world that descent with modification is true. And this is my number two thing that everybody ought to know about evolution. That it may not be true, but everybody who knows everything, everybody who knows anything, has thought it was true for about the last 130 years. No evolutionary biologist gets up in the morning and tests number one. Explicitly. I mean, we're open to weird things if they happen, but they haven't happened. So nobody has questioned since 1880, number one. Okay? That's just historical fact. Darwin tries to do a second thing, though, in The Origin. He tries to convince the reader not only that descent with modification has occurred, but that he has a mechanism by which descent with modification could occur. And that mechanism, of course, is what he calls natural selection. And he also puts out all this evidence that natural selection has occurred. And this is a genuinely novel idea. Evolution had been around in other terms, but natural selection is novel with Darwin. And he tries to convince people that it's true. In object number two here, Darwin is almost completely unsuccessful. It is not for another 60 years It is not until the 1940s, 30s and 40s, that biologists come to accept natural selection as the most powerful mechanism of evolutionary change. Okay, so let me just repeat this because this is really important. By 1880, anybody who knows anything thinks evolution is true, descent with modification. But they don't universally agree on natural selection until the 1940s. So what does that mean? That means that a statement that evolution is true is not connected necessarily to a statement of mechanism of evolution. And this is important because when you read the newspapers, all except the New York Times, what do the headlines say? If they ever cover anything in evolutionary biology, what do the headlines in most newspapers say? Scientists debate evolution. And since we all know that we don't read beyond the first paragraph, right, or even the headline, what do you take away from it? Well, scientists are debating evolution, hey, it might not be true. This is one of the most important ideas in this whole subject. No evolutionary biologist has wondered whether evolution was true in 130 years, but we still have food fights about the mechanism. Natural selection, if you walk across the Tower Road here to Corson Hall, take a poll of the faculty over there and say, how many of you think evolution is driven mainly by natural selection? You'll probably get 80%. Maybe even more than that. How many of you think it's driven exclusively 100% by natural selection? 20%. In other words, you'll get, there's still very vigorous debate. And that's what people like me do for a living when they're being researchers, okay? We research the mechanism, not that evolution occurs. The world doesn't understand. Okay. What is natural selection? Why was it so difficult to accept? One way to think about it is, in the words of famous evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley, 3 unarguable observations and 2 inescapable conclusions. The 3 observations are, and when Huxley called them unarguable, he means that we can all pretty much go outside this afternoon and make some observations almost literally on the lawn out there, and you'd have to be silly to deny them. Observation number 1, there is variation. There are no 2 organisms on Earth that are identical. Even identical twins are not identical. So there is variation. Observation number 2, at least some of that variation is inherited. How do we know that? Because Labrador retrievers have Labrador retrievers, and you look just like your mother. Okay? So we know that at least some of that variation is inherited. We know some of it isn't, of course, but we know that some of it is. And observation number 3, there is vast overproduction. What do we mean by that? That means that vastly more offspring will be born than will survive to reproduce. That's all it means. Up until recently, of course, this was true of humans as well, and tragically it's still true in many places in the world today, right? But we can see it right here in the United States, in upstate New York. Well, the mean family size in America has done what over the last 100 years? Right? You don't see many families of 11 kids anymore, whereas 100 years ago, probably people on this quad were studying the rural life of families with 11 kids, right? So even in humans, it's true that more offspring are produced than will survive to reproduce themselves. That is extremely true, and you all can think of examples of that you've heard about or seen. How much grass seed is produced compared to the grass that sprouts? How many, it's pollen and seed season in Ithaca right now, how many pollen grains are washing down the driveway? How many maple seeds are washing into the creek never to sprout, etc., etc.? How many eggs does a female oyster produce? How many baby salmon are there? And how many turtles hatch and go out to sea, and come back 20 years later? I think it's 1/100th of 1% in some populations. Okay, so you get the idea. There is vast overproduction. Okay, so these are not debatable, really. I mean, you have to be silly to debate them. Okay, Darwin said if those 3 observations are true, as generalities, then there must be what he called a struggle for existence. And he got in trouble for this phrase because, of course, this is the 19th century when we're all supposed to be out there beating each other over the head in a kind of rigorous capitalist world, right? And so this was interpreted as the good old American, get out of my way, or I'll hit you kind of struggle. Darwin didn't mean it that way. Darwin didn't mean, as Wordsworth said, nature red in tooth and claw. He meant, back to number 3 there, if there is vast overproduction, if there are many more offspring produced than will survive to reproduce themselves, what does that mean? It means that when you're born, you are not guaranteed a seat at the table. Now, I like to, when I'm talking to college audiences, undergraduates, I like to use this example. I used it one time for high school seniors and it didn't go over well. Imagine, I'm sure this wasn't true for you or your children or grandchildren, but imagine if we said to the senior class of a high school in September, you are all guaranteed admission to the college of your choice next spring. Guaranteed, no matter what you do this year. And again, I'm sure this doesn't apply to any of you or your families, but what do you think would happen? Just hypothetically. Right? I'm sure they all work equally hard, right? Of course. The analogy is quite good. Why do seniors sweat, right? Because they're applying to college. So why do seniors, why are they getting out those, we used to call it college suck points? Why are they, signing up for all these organizations? Why are they working hard to get A's in the fall of senior year? What's that all about? Because they're not guaranteed admission to the college of their choice. And therefore, and this is Darwin's struggle, they've got to hustle. That's what Darwin meant. That you are not guaranteed to grow up and reproduce once you're born. And therefore, you better hustle. Because somebody's going to survive and reproduce. So if it's going to be you, you better get out and, work hard. You don't have to hit your friend over the head, but you've got to get out and work hard. Okay, if that's true, then, and here's the slightly complex part, it must be that, on average, those organisms that do survive and reproduce will be, on average, those that have heritable traits that allow them to do so more effectively. In this sense, natural selection cannot be denied. It must occur. I want to emphasize that. It must occur. The question always, and everybody knew that when Darwin wrote his book, the question is that adequate to explain evolution? That's the issue. Okay? So that's natural selection. And that's all it is, by the way. And Julian's grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was famous for saying how incredibly stupid of me not to have thought of it before. Okay, so that's evolution in a nutshell. What's creationism? A general definition of creationism, very general, is that everything we see was created by a supernatural force. If you want to say this in a public school, then you say supernatural force. If you want to say it in a non-public school, you say God. And I'll come back to that point in a couple minutes. If this was about rocks and the universe, we wouldn't be sitting here. It's about organisms and people. So, but it does include everything, and that gets back to geology. However, there are a huge number of variants of what we would call creationism, and we could sit around all morning and talk about that. It's a fascinating topic in sociology, actually, and it's not restricted to America. It's not restricted to any one culture. It's all over the place. And in fact, the vast majority of human beings are today, and have always been, creationists by this definition. So just a couple of variants. There are things called, people call young Earth creationists, or YECs, YECs. They call themselves that. And those are the ones that you often read about that actually believe that the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Versus older creationists that actually have no problem with millions or billions of years, but that a supernatural power created everything. There are creationists who believe in one creation, That is a kind of an Adam and Eve version or a Genesis version, that it all got done and created all once, and everything has unfolded from there. There are creationists who believe in continuing creation, it's sometimes called, or sequential creation, that God is always intervening and creating as we go, like Louis Agassiz thought. And then finally, most interestingly, there are individuals, including the last pope, not this pope, but the last pope, who said that I got no problem with anything in evolutionary biology, including, he said, all of human evolution. He actually wrote this in 1996, wrote a fascinating letter about it. He said, Darwinism is more than a theory. It's true. Up until, he said, you get to the human soul. And that's not natural, John Paul said. Okay, so that's the kind of extreme version of a non-creationist creationist. And so the point is, there's everything in between, all over the place. And most people, in fact, have never articulated it very clearly, even if they think they go to church and read the Bible. Really, most people don't think about this day to day, but most people believe some version of that. Okay, so you all know some of this, but it's useful to just review this here. 1859, just before Cornell was founded, Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, 150 years ago this year. 1925, and Darwin's buried in Westminster Abbey. He becomes a household name, very famous person. Cornell faculty are teaching Darwinism almost as soon as the university opens. In 1925, the next time the public really gets, at least in this country, gets focused on this is because of the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee, and that is the famous confrontation between William Jennings Bryan on the right and Clarence Darrow on the left. Most of us learned about this through the play and then the movie Inherit the Wind, which is pretty wrong in just about everything, but is a nice story. The Scopes trial, is important to remember that the Scopes trial resulted, and you don't get this from the movie, the Scopes trial resulted in John Scopes being convicted, because he actually was guilty, and fined $100. But you couldn't fine somebody more than $50 in Tennessee without a jury trial, so the verdict was overturned on a technicality, and it was never, there was no retrial, and so the ACLU did not, which brought the case, did not get to do what they wanted to do, which was to move it up the ladder to the Supreme Court. And so the law stayed on the books in Tennessee and a half dozen other states until 1968. You don't get that from the movie. William Jennings Bryan, has the good grace to die right after the trial, and they naming a little college after him in Dayton, Tennessee. And we think that truth and enlightenment has prevailed. Not at all. It isn't until 1968, in a famous case called Epperson v. Arkansas, that the U.S. Supreme Court rules that laws like the state of Tennessee law that made Scopes' conviction possible, that it is illegal to teach, and actually the language in the Tennessee law is illegal to teach that man is descended from lower beings. But those kinds of laws that make it illegal to teach evolution are unconstitutional. So it's not until 1968. The next time it comes to public, real broad national public attention is in another famous case. In this case, it's a federal court case in Little Rock, Arkansas, McLean v. Arkansas, and in one of those wonderful juxtapositions, a very, very scientifically enlightened federal judge got the case and wrote a magnificent opinion saying that creation science, which was the new version of creationism, was also unconstitutional because it was religion. So that was 1981. It's worth noting here, if you're a history buff, it's worth noting, politically, what was the country like in the 1920s? Not very liberal, right? This was immigration restrictions. This was back to normalcy. This is Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. This is politically a very conservative time, flappers notwithstanding. It was politically a very conservative time. Is 68 a very conservative time? Interesting, yeah. So, oops, sorry. Who's president in 1981?
Reagan.
We just got a statue of the Capitol yesterday.
Reagan.
Right? that's not coincidental, okay? It is not coincidental that in America, this story mirrors the national political mood. And in 1987, it finally makes it to the Supreme Court again, this time for a Louisiana case. The Supreme Court rules exactly what the federal judge did, which is that creation science is unconstitutional. It's not science, it's religion. So, oops. Sorry. So then, it pretty much goes away. How come you think it goes away? Because who gets elected in 92? Right? So the 90s, nobody's really thinking about this stuff, at least publicly. And there are no big cases. Until the late 90s. What's happening in the late 90s? So in the late 90s, a group gets together and starts to invent a new approach. Because creation science has been thrown out in the 80s in court. So what's the new approach to creationism? The new approach is called intelligent design. And intelligent design, we'll talk about in a second, it's a very old idea, it's not a new idea. And they say, they learned from their predecessors. And they used phrases like, creationists are seen as toothless pigs from the backwoods, and we got to get past that. And so they created a document called the Wedge document. And the Wedge document was a manifesto of essentially conservative political and religious values. It was a sociological, political, religious document that said the edge of the wedge is creationism and evolution. And after we get in with that, we are going to drive the wedge in, and we are going to splinter, their words, we are going to splinter modern materialism and the Enlightenment, they even said that. This document was secret until it was posted on the web, as all things are, and it became this very celebrated document that looked what the religious right is trying to foist on people. But that was part of the general not nice dialogue in the country around that time. Nobody really thought much about it until we get to the Dover Intelligent Design Trial in 2005. So what you notice here is that the history of American creationism is kind of punctuated by what the political mood is. Creationism in America has never really changed. This is just when it comes to the front pages. Okay, so what is intelligent design? Intelligent design is actually a very old idea. It was invented in its modern form by a guy named William Paley. And William Paley's an important guy. He was probably the most widely read author in Britain at the turn of the 18th, 19th century. Darwin loved his writing and read all of it and said that he could even recite big chunks of it by memory. It was required reading at Cambridge, where Darwin went. Darwin, and one of history's little delicious factoids, Darwin lived in the same rooms at Cambridge that Paley did. And so Darwin knew Paley pretty well. Paley wrote a wonderful book in 1802, and he said the following: if I find a watch on the ground, what will I make of that? I will make that it is manufactured by somebody. It is that if there is a watch, there is a watchmaker. And if I said otherwise, you'd call me silly. That analogy is obviously very powerful. If you find a watch, you don't say, wow, I wonder if the wind swept that together. You say, where's the watchmaker? So Paley made that an argument for what was called natural theology, that if there is design, then there must be a designer. Okay, Darwin is imbued with this. He reads it, he takes it seriously, he believes it, he likes it, and then of course it goes around the world in the Beagle 30 years later and begins to think otherwise. And the point of this story is Darwin writes the origin and invents natural selection in direct address of intelligent design. Intelligent design is not new. It isn't something that Darwin ever thought of. It's something that Darwin thought of intensely since he was 18 years old. But modern intelligent design didn't want you to know any of that. Modern intelligent design said it was modern science, right? This is science stuff, and we're all going to have PhDs, and we're all going to publish. The Wedge document said that, by the way, too. We all get out and publish in peer-reviewed literature, because they picked on us for that back in the 80s, too. So we're all going to get out and publish. We're going to be scientists. We're not going to have, Southern accents and be hayseeds and all this kind of stuff. So they created new paraphernalia really around it. And one of them was that to paraphrase Paley, they didn't cite it, but they paraphrased it. And they said, you know, there are things that are just too complex to have arisen by anything other than a intelligent supernatural designer. But you know what? This is science. Science is going to prove that supernatural design is taking place. Okay, so that's what modern intelligent design was. This is the chief architect. He's still alive. I understand he's not in great health. He was a frequent lecturer here at Cornell, frequent guest lecturer here at Cornell throughout the 90s in Will Provine's class. His name's Philip Johnson. He's a very, very celebrated criminal law professor at the University of California, so he's no slouch, no hasty to him. He is an extraordinarily articulate, extraordinarily intelligent guy, and he decided in the early 1990s, apparently he had literally a midlife crisis, and he decided to devote the rest of his life to overthrowing Darwin. That's how he said it. And so he became this incredibly powerful speaker on behalf of this new thing called intelligent design. And he was intimately involved in the invention of this thing called the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which promulgated all of this, and he was one of the chief authors of the wedge strategy. And one of the phrases in the wedge strategy that got a lot of attention when it made the web was this. Our strategy, they said, seeks nothing less than the overthrow of materialism and its cultural legacies. That's what this was about. Okay, so what about modern intelligent design? Basically, they have Paley's argument. If it looks intricate and designed, I have a 2-year-old daughter now, and I'm taking her out in the field every morning, every evening, and I'm saying, wow, look at the flower. Isn't that neat? And I can almost hear it coming right behind me, you know, kind of saying, isn't it amazing how somebody made it to do that, right? I mean, we've all said it looks like somebody made it to do that. We all watch nature television, right? And usually the British accent, you have to say, and the cheetah. Oh, and isn't it amazing how it... So we all do it. If it's designed, somebody must have designed it. There's only 2 problems, though. Darwin already addressed that. That's what natural selection does. Natural selection explains apparent design without supernatural causation. And furthermore, in modern intelligent design, they never actually tell you the criteria for design. They never tell you what design is. They never tell you how to recognize it. They come back and they say, well, yes, we did. We call it irreducible complexity, a phrase that they've made very famous. And despite books and books and books about this, by them and critiques by others, there is no definition anywhere, that would pass muster on this campus as science of irreducible complexity. There is no test. You can't falsify it. You can't quantify it. You can't say this is or this isn't. It doesn't say it isn't true. It's just that we can't do anything with it. And furthermore, as I'll show you in a moment, we have an answer for where very complex things come from. And as usual, it was in Darwin. Natural selection is a brilliant idea because it took all of the observations of William Paley and people like him. The observations are perfectly great. And they say, and natural selection says, put supernatural causes aside for a second, can we explain them in terms of materialistic scientific causes? The answer is yes. That's what natural selection does. And all of these, I just pulled 4 random pictures off the web. You all have your favorite examples. How did these organisms come to be as they are? That's the question. That's what people across the street here work on. How did these organisms come to look and act like they do? And you can't explain most of that with natural selection. You just can't. Furthermore, the intelligent designers will say, well, what about incredibly complex structures? You couldn't take anything away from them because they wouldn't have that complexity anymore and they wouldn't be so intricately designed. I mean, imagine if you took your watch and took one of the wheels out of it, right? Darwin dealt with it. And I was thinking about this back in 2005. I was thinking about this at my favorite local restaurant here, perhaps you've been to, Maxie's Supper Club, which is a Cajun restaurant. And the night I was sitting at the bar, happened to have live music that night, happened to have Cajun music. So if you don't know anything about Cajun music involves the use of this, right? This is a washboard. I won't ask for a show of hands, but some of you might even use a washboard to wash clothes. This being Ithaca, I think there's still probably people around here who do. Washboards were invented to do what? They're designed to do what? Wash clothes. Okay? But when I looked over at the Cajun band, here's what I saw. I mean, this isn't Maxie's, but it's the same thing. Fiddle, accordion, and washboard. And in fact, if you compare the two washboards there, what do you notice? They're about the same thing, right? So the gentleman down in the picture here on the far right literally took a washboard off the shelf that was being sold to wash clothes, didn't do anything to it, and used it for what? A different function. Well, now what happened? This is the modern musical washboard that you buy. So you don't, I mean, you could if you're an old-timey kind of person use an old-fashioned washboard, but this is the super-duper deluxe musical washboard, which presumably is not so good for washing clothes because you put it on yourself, right? And you wouldn't want to do this against it. What's the message? Evolution, and Darwin said this, evolution works by taking what is present and tinkering with it. Darwin never said, nor has virtually any other evolutionary biologist said, natural selection is about saying, let's think up the most perfect solution to this problem. There it is. That's not how Darwinian evolution works. Okay? And despite all of the efforts to the contrary, intelligent designers neglect that. I want to give you one real-world example of this that you might be familiar with. On the left, you probably recognize that. That is one of 10 known specimens of something called Archaeopteryx, which is still today the oldest known bird in the world. It's about 150 million years old. Comes from Germany. All 10 specimens come from Bavaria, Germany. It's a big news item when a new specimen pops up. There are only 10 of them. This is probably the most famous fossil in the world. It's the so-called Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx, found in 1860. And it is remarkable because if you, of course it has feathers preserved, feather impressions preserved, but if you take away the feathers and you look at it, this is the skeleton of Archaeopteryx compared to the skeleton of a modern pigeon. Archaeopteryx is clearly not a modern pigeon. It's very different. It has a lot of differences. So if Archaeopteryx hadn't been preserved with feathers, we would have called it a little dinosaur. So in 1860, this fossil was found. Interesting timing, right? Right after the origin was published, and much hay was made about that. Feathers on a dinosaur. Wow. There's an intermediate case in the fossil record, and everybody recognizes that. If you look at the feathers of Archaeopteryx, though, in more detail, and this is a blow-up view of, I think, this area on this specimen, what do you see? You see that there's a lot of detail here. We really know what the feathers of Archaeopteryx look like. And there's something interesting about them. They're not identical to the flight feathers, to the primary feathers on the crows out in the wild. They're not exactly identical to the flight feathers of a modern bird. And now, when you go back and look at Archaeopteryx, you notice that there's something else interesting here. So Archaeopteryx would not be a good Christmas turkey, right? When you carve your breast meat off a Christmas turkey, what you're actually carving is this gigantic muscle that comes out on the sternum, the breastbone, of a bird that flies, would be like out to here on me if I was a flighted bird. And it would be this gigantic pectoral muscle, like this, and that is the white meat that you carve off of a turkey. Archaeopteryx doesn't have a big keel breastbone. What's the answer to the story? Archaeopteryx probably did not do this very much. The feathers aren't designed to do it, or expression, and he didn't have the musculature in the skeleton to do it. But wait a minute. Why do birds have feathers? Birds have feathers to fly. So, as soon as Archaeopteryx was found, 150 years ago, people started to say, you know, this doesn't explain the origin of feathers. It explains the origin of birds, but it doesn't explain the origin of feathers. Where do feathers come from? Feathers, in other words, could not have been created by natural selection to fly, because Archaeopteryx didn't fly, and yet it had perfectly good feathers. You with me? Well, then where did feathers come from? So, 100 years goes by, and paleontologists are thinking about this. And when I was an undergraduate, everybody had decided that this had been solved, but it was a thought experiment. The thought experiment was, if feathers weren't used for flight, then what else could a bird use feathers for? And if you go out to lab ornithology and ask them what a bird uses feathers for, you'll find two other answers. Display, that is courtship and so forth, and insulation. Well, we can't see colors on fossils, but we can see that feathers were there, and so a prediction was made about 25 years ago. Feathers probably evolved for insulation in small dinosaur-like reptiles, not for flight. But that hypothesis could never be tested at the time. Well, if you pay attention at all to, like, the Science Times every Tuesday in the New York Times, you will see, I guess it's old news now so they don't do it as much, but during the last 15 years, I'd say once a year, there has been in the New York Times a new feathered dinosaur from China. And that's usually the headline, feathered dinosaur. And here's just one of these creatures. They're about the same age as Archaeopteryx. They look like little dinosaurs, but they have feathers. They're not Archaeopteryx, they're not birds, but they have feathers. Bottom line, this is a family tree of dinosaurs. If you're looking for some orientation, here's T-Rex, here's the crow outside, and feathers are invented before the origination of Tyrannosaurus rex. I'm going to say that again. Feathers were invented before the invention of the world's most famous dinosaur. T-Rex were pretty sure it didn't fly. Okay? So in other words, this is how evolution works. Evolution invents structures, natural selection invents structures that serve one function, and then they get co-opted to play music on, or to fly with. Okay, so what I've just told you in a very brief nutshell is what this incredibly distinguished man figured out in listening to, I think, 8 weeks of testimony in Dover, Pennsylvania. This is Judge John Jones. And again, the forces of light got really fortunate here. He was, by all accounts, a conservative, he was Bush appointee, federal judge, a politically conservative jurist, had never made any waves on anything, but he got the case. And I guess, I don't know all the details, but federal judges get cases pretty much by chance. They get assigned these cases by chance. Well, it turns out that Judge Jones, as he started, and he said he'd never even heard of intelligent design, and he barely heard of Charles Darwin when he took the case. As it turns out, this guy, as he started to listen to the testimony, as he started to learn more about it, said, you know what? Somebody's got to do something about this. And he made it clear that however he decided this case was going to be decided with great clarity. So he could have written like a 30-page opinion. He wrote a 130-page opinion, which I highly recommend to you. It's brilliantly written. It's wonderfully written. And what it says is, intelligent design is religion. And it uses wonderful examples and verbiage. It calls intelligent design incredible inanity. That's a great. And then he did something else. He went on the lecture circuit. Sitting federal judges hardly ever go out and talk about their cases. He now has an agent. We've tried to get him to Cornell. And he's a wonderful speaker. I've heard him speak. He told everybody this is why he did it. And here's an interview in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It would be a dreadful waste of judicial resources, legal resources, taxpayer money to replicate this trial somewhere else. I purposely allowed the trial to extend and a record to be made. The defendants could never say they weren't given the opportunity to present their case. Wow, did we get lucky. Okay, so what is intelligent design about today? The Dover decision, of course, was amazing and was reported around the world very shortly after the Dover decision. 2 cases came to courts elsewhere in the United States and were decided in favor of or against intelligent design. Intelligent design has not made it to court since early 2006. Intelligent design, by all accounts, and I agree with this, is essentially dead as an intellectual rule. You're not going to see intelligent design pop up anytime soon in a court near you because of Judge Jones's resounding, he really drove a stake through its heart. But, just like the Scopes trial, creationism hasn't changed one iota. Not one bit. And I just want to give you an example of that. This is an email I literally got yesterday. I think it was yesterday. So this was sent to me by, because I'm a member of something called the National Center for Science Education, which is an anti-creationism kind of SWAT team out in California. And we collaborate with them at PRI. So I got this email. We apologize, blah, blah, blah. The Louisiana Science Education Act will soon be implemented in Louisiana public schools, encouraging use of, quote, supplemental materials, attacking the science of evolution, origins, look at this list. Evolution, origins of life, climate change, and research on stem cells. By name, those are mentioned in the law. The State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education is approving a policy to implement it, which is available at. We are concerned, of course, that this is going to be put in the schools. This is the next head of the hydra, if I can use that expression. And this is now, this is just the one I got yesterday. Texas has just been through this. Florida has just been through this. This is the next head of the hydra. It is not intelligent design. They're not calling it that because they can't, with justification. The next wave, which is breaking on us now, is some combination of supplementary materials, opening our minds for open discussion, freedom of thought in the classroom, because we don't want to suppress anybody's thought, etc. And I will make a prediction to you here that the next time Republicans are in the White House, there will be another court case of something like this. So the last thing last 2 things I want to mention, back to the book. So that's what the book's about, is talking about that. What does this all have to do with geology? Well, the next time you're looking at a rock, I won't ask for a show of hands again, but try it. Just walk along, just walk somewhere, and look at a rock. Even if you're in the middle of the city, there's a pebble, that somebody put on gravel somewhere. Pick it up. Look at it. Describe it. Is it simple? No, it's not. You think it is, but it isn't. Geological structures are complex. Here are some very complex ones. The cover of the book, actually, which Jill picked, is an inside joke for geologists. This is the most famous, one of the most famous outcrops in the world. It is an outcrop on the east coast of Scotland called Sicker Point, and it is the location where the famous geologist James Hutton created the notion of what geologists call an unconformity. And what it says is, here's the same picture, what it says is that there are rocks going this way, and there are rocks going this way. And just that geometry requires us to infer a complex history. And Hutton said that in 1789. Just that geometry requires us to have complex history. Well, we don't have folded rocks here in central New York, but as I tell Cornell students, if you had not been fortunate enough to be admitted to Cornell and had to go to Dartmouth, all the rocks in your backyard would look like this. Where did those come from? Why did they look like that? This is complexity. Complexity exists everywhere in nature. And so, if intelligent design is true, then all this was designed supernaturally too. You're saying, well, Warren, wait a minute, maybe it was designed supernaturally. I mean, what if it really was? And that's what I personally contributed to this book. I wrote about, I've been looking for an excuse to do this for a long time. This is the most common question that professors get when they're teaching undergraduates about evolution. Non-major undergraduates about evolution. If they don't say it, they're thinking it. Will Provine has shown for decades on this campus that about 50% of Cornell undergraduates are willing to accept some version of evolution, and about 50% aren't. And that mirrors the national polls pretty closely. And the bold ones will come up to their professor and say, I'm kind of concerned because, I'm religious, or I was raised religious, and you're telling me something else here. What's the story? And they're very concerned, the ones that raise it. Of course, 99% of them are thinking it, not saying it, because undergraduates don't actually talk to faculty. So I've been looking for an excuse to personally answer this for myself. I personally am an atheist. I see no need, no evidence for a deity, but you are dealing with a student population that's 50% not that way. Well, it turns out that there's a gigantic literature of this. There's now even a field called religious and science studies. There are institutes and journals and all the accoutrements of an academic field now. There's something called the John Templeton Foundation, you might have heard of, that gives away gobs of money to people that want to try to answer that question. And it turns out there's a spectrum of answers, and you're probably familiar with some of the major players on that spectrum because they're very famous names. On the yes side, and I believe in both God and Darwin, are a number of notables, and in fact the vast majority of defenders of evolution, including Judge Jones. Yes, they say, we can absolutely have our cake and eat it too, because, number one, there are a whole bunch of people that do it. Now, either those people are crazy or lying to themselves. There are many self-proclaimed religious scientists on this campus, religious evolutionary biologists on this campus. There are many, several paleontologists are my good friends and colleagues. They're self-consciously very religious. So either they're crazy or they're lying to themselves or something, right? So there are religious evolutionary biologists out there. So, okay. And number two, and Stephen Jay Gould made this argument kind of famous, they are non-overlapping realms of human experience. That is, you can go to church and you can be a scientist and they don't have to speak to the same themes. And that is that religion is about what the meaning of our life is, and science is about how things work, to paraphrase. Absolutely not, say, a small but growing group of very conspicuous and loud people. Richard Dawkins being the most famous and unapologetic and offensive. They make a very, very clear argument, and this is what attracted me to the topic. They make a very clear argument. The clear argument is as follows, and this gets back to natural selection. And this is what the kids really want to know. Darwin said the following. Darwin said that evolution is true, right? And everybody accepted that. But then he said that natural selection drives evolution. And natural selection, he said, is purposeless, directionless, non-teleological. It does not guarantee progress. It does not guarantee goodness. It does not guarantee beauty or harmony or all the wonderful things that we would like to have in the world. It's just there. Nothing exists in Darwin's world except for individual organisms struggling to survive and reproduce. And from that, he said, all of the beauty and structure we see out there has arisen. And he finds that, and I'm being a little theatrical here to try to mirror this, his famous last paragraph, there is grandeur in this view of life. That all of the apparent design that we see out there wasn't created by somebody micromanaging it. It was created by the struggles of individual organisms to simply survive and reproduce. Does this sound, for any economists in the room, does this sound like anything you've ever heard before? Adam Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith said you might think the way to organize an economy is to micromanage it and plan it and so forth, right? Adam Smith said, no, let's just let individuals struggle for their own benefit and order will materialize. It remains to be seen whether that was true or not. And we know Darwin was reading What does it say? It says that nobody is taking care of you. It says that you are not guaranteed anything. It says that there is no inherent meaning in the world. There is no inherent meaning to your biological existence. And furthermore, if you go to the other side of Corson, the building that Corson's in, Mud Hall, you will find a whole other department dedicated to the proposition that even our psychology and our behavior and our religion were also created by natural selection. Whoa, now, undergraduate, you may be religious, but you know why you're religious? You're religious because you were naturally selected to be religious. If we had all morning, we could go around the room and we could say, what's your religious background, what do you think, and so forth. But if you try to imagine the spectrum that exists away from you of these ideas, from the extremely religious, and they all exist on this campus, from the extremely religious to the totally atheistic. Totally atheistic says, I got no problem with that, cool. And the totally religious says, if that is true, then I'm going to kill myself, because there's no meaning in life. That's the problem. So in thinking about it, so what do you tell the undergraduate, right? I mean, you're packing up, the next lecture is coming in, what are you going to say? Besides come to office hours, which they never do. So what do you say? So here's what I say. I say, there is a spectrum of views, just empirically, there is a spectrum of views out there, and smart people hold this entire spectrum. From totally atheistic view, there is no God. Will Provine is very famous, but much more benign in his presentation of it than Richard Dawkins. If we move a little bit down the spectrum, you get what George Washington thought, that a God created the universe, wound the clock, if you will, and set it going, and hasn't really bothered with it since. Classical Enlightenment deism. If you keep going here, you get to the views of some of my paleontologist, religious paleontologist colleagues. God intervenes all the time in their lives, they think. They really can't explain how or why. And in fact, it doesn't bother them a whit. When you ask them, and this is what I talked about in my chapter here, when you ask them, if you were a neurobiologist, would you be so unconcerned? And my paleontologist colleagues don't like to talk about that. But they say they're totally fine with this. But keep going. And you get to faculty on this campus who primarily in fields like food science, engineering, human ecology, areas like that, who are quite open with the fact that they are either young Earth creationists or old Earth creationists, and that God does miracles every day. Really serious miracles, answers my prayers, listens to them, intervenes on a regular basis in the material lives of human beings all the time. And I say, well, what happens if your experiment does that? They have a completely airtight answer to that. God and I have an understanding. God would not do that. God would not trick it. All the way to the opinion of a lot of people, if they thought about it, which is, I don't even think about any of this stuff. God just does everything, all the time. Really smart people have all of those views on this campus. So, what's the answer? On the one side, Dawkins is offensive to me personally. I think he's a brilliant man, a great writer, a good communicator. But Dawkins sticks his finger in people's eye, and because he can, of course. I can't. I'm in the business, as Will says, I have to dissemble because I deal with the public, is the way he puts it. No, that's not true. I deal with undergraduates the same way he does. You can't stick your finger in people's eye and say, see? Unless you're an atheist, you're an idiot. If you take your kids to church, it's child abuse. It's Dawkins' line. We can prove that there is no God. No, you can't. There is no scientific proof for non-existence of something. And furthermore, you can't prove what science can't prove. You can't test what science can't test. This is like a semantic point. You can't test what's not material. What if God is not material? I don't think he is, but I have no opinion about it. But what if it is? And what if I can't possibly understand it? I have no scientific opinion. On the other hand, it is not the case to say what Steve Gould said, which was, let's all get along, basically. You can believe in religion, and you can believe in God, and you believe in science and Darwinism. Don't worry about it. That's not true. Because if your religion requires certain statements about the material world to be true, in order for you to have your faith, and those material statements have been falsified by science, it's a lie to stand up in front of a group of students and say, don't worry about it. It just is. And if your faith depends on the world being 10,000 years old, then that's not okay, because that's not reconcilable with science. I mean, you can believe it if you want to, but it can't be true and the world be 4.6 billion years old. It can't. Gould got away with it, as many reviewers pointed out, because being basically a secular New York Jew, as he was, and very proud of it, when he said religion, he didn't really mean that. When he said religion, he meant ethics and morals. He meant the meaning of life. And what he meant as the meaning of life was religion. And somebody pointed out, excuse me, but there's no God in that, you know? So, yeah, we can all, scientists are deeply spiritual people sometimes, deeply metaphysical people sometimes, but not about our science. Some of the statements that undergraduates want to make just on science. And some statements that former presidents in the United States have made are just on science. And the punchline of all of this is that we haven't figured this out yet. We haven't resolved this yet. And I don't know whether we ever will, because, which is a depressing thought if we start to think about it, but we may never actually get the answer to this question. The world is not headed in the secular direction, but yet the world is not headed away from secularism either, because technology, which is secular, drives our lives. So this may be one of the permanent conundrums of the human existence, which is either invigorating because it keeps philosophers employed, or it's we all better recognize that there aren't any clear answers. So in retrospect, the book came out kind of after the horse had already left the barn. But I think that the themes that are in this book and many, many, many others are still absolutely with us, and will probably be with us for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.